Welcome to episode 57 of the World Builder's Anvil. My name is Jeffrey W. Ingram, and today's topic, do you microclimate? Don't know where to start building your fantasy world? Do you need more? Does it make sense? Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination. This is the place that will help prime your mind. Now, it's time to heat up the forge, break out the mithril ingots and hammer. Welcome to the World Builder's Anvil. I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram. Let's sup from the mug of Java and build. Welcome back, and let's get right into today's topic. What is microclimate? And to sum it up really quickly, to the best of my understanding, microclimate is just a small area where the temperature is different or the climate itself is different than the area surrounding it. When I say do you microclimate, you probably to a degree do. You probably construct things that will actually change the climate within them. You know, the whole reason we have houses are to help control the environment for which we live. In a way, every time we build a house, we are doing microclimates. But the reason I'm broaching this topic has very little to do with the kinds of structures that we build, or at least the minor structures like houses we build to create microclimates. I'm assuming you have structures within the world you are. If you're in sci-fi, you most definitely have microclimates if you have reached space and spacecraft or space stations. But there are two types of categories I like to think about with microclimates. One is creative, and I went over the structures part of that a little bit, but you also can have larger structures which create strange microclimates like dams. Dams can have a huge change in an environment. They can create lakes. Around the lakes, vegetation will grow a little bit differently than what existed before. So dams are one. But more importantly, we're talking about genre fiction or genre games. And so there may be some other ways to also gain microclimates. Magical. Perhaps you use spells to connect up different elements. So you create a permanent spring in a desert. That would be changing that climate in maybe a very small way, depending on the heat of the sun. We're talking about more of a heat-caused desert. The heat of the sun might get rid of most of the water, so the impact might be minimal. But you're definitely creating a new little ecosystem in that spot of the spring. Supernatural, maybe there's a connection to another world. And when I say a connection to another world, I mean like a portal to where the fairies live, or some supernatural realm other than our own. And perhaps because of that connection, there is a slight shift in the temperature of the area. Maybe it's a little warmer or a little cooler. Maybe the rain sticks around a little bit more. Maybe it's a bog in the area that a bog doesn't really make sense. But it's because of this connection. Or technological. Like I was saying, a space station would be an extreme microclimate, because outside of the space station you would have vacuum, and that would not be a good place for human life. Now, on a larger scale, to give an example of what I mean by these things, early on in my previous iteration of my world, I was doing this very long-term campaign with my friend Matthew Bannock. And Matthew had this world Polivia, and I had this world Gardul. And Polivia was like this sort of tropical island area, and Gardul is sort of a Pangean continent with some islands that surround it. But what we did to try and create a connection, because we knew over the course of, this took, I believe, at least 2 years, both of us running different campaigns, we were drawing characters through this long story that would eventually bring them through on an island in, I believe it was my world, but it was in this area that was warmer than it should have been. And the reason was because at the time I quantified it as the plane of fire. The plane of fire got really close to the physical realm of the world, and it caused the area to heat up. And it was sort of an unnatural connection. And what they did sort of severed the connections between the two worlds for good. And then it started snowing was sort of the end of that story. And beyond the look of shock on the players who had been in both campaigns or one of the two campaigns for years. And it was sort of like what you call anticlimactic ending on top of it. They felt they were part of this huge epic, and it ends up that they really were maybe the bad guys. But at the end, you're on what was a tropical island, and now it's snowing. Now, beyond created, there are many forms of natural microclimates. And these are things that you should really consider a little bit more. There are ways to sort of introduce unique types of climates and sort of vary up the climates a little bit logically, naturally in your world that you're telling your story in. So the things that I think you should think about, probably the most common that I know of would be maritime microclimates. And I live in Connecticut. In Connecticut, there's a shoreline because it's a shore because Long Island Sound is not the open ocean, so it's called a shore. But if you go to the shore, it's usually cooler because it has the sea breeze. And the climate is different from where I live to the shoreline. And in the summer, it's awesome for the shoreline. In the winter, maybe not so much. And it kind of depends on how the jet stream moves or whatever. But they're very apt to getting sort of snow or ice storms. And that's much less common up here. Usually we do get more accumulation than they do, but our weather is slightly more consistent than on the shore. They're usually on that sort of wet line for getting the big heavy snow or getting ice or sleet, sort of mixed precipitations. But that's just the effect of the ocean air sweeping across. And it's powered up a little bit more on the East Coast because of the Gulf Stream comes up the East Coast and shifts out. Connecticut's a little bit further away from that, but it still gets the benefits of having the warm air come up. Not so good when it brings up the weather that causes the nor'easters. But hey, there's a price for everything. There's always an issue with weather wherever you live. Highlands. This is also probably fairly common. And it was actually highlands that sort of sparked me thinking more about this topic. I was watching a documentary called Wildest Islands, I believe. And one of the episodes was on the island of Sri Lanka. And once again, I'm sure I slaughtered that name. But it's this island off of the coast of India. You'll see it it's big enough that you'll see it even on most globes. And the area around there had some ingenious people who lived there and built this very intricate reservoir system, sort of take advantage of the monsoons. So they have your standard monsoon, wet season, dry season near the equator, really hot, icky weather. And so you'll have way too much rain and then way too much dryness the rest of the year. But because of these reservoirs, water stays in abundance on the island. So it was a really brilliant move by the culture that was on that island, taking advantage of the environment that they were dealt. And that's the brilliant thing about cultures. They will take advantage of where they live to survive. And then if they can get a little bit extra, they will survive and they will thrive and they will move forward. Unless something else comes along that messes it up. But as they build that, you have this sort of area that will become really dry for a good chunk of the year. But higher up, you have highlands in the middle of the island. And you have all of these trees that actually gather moisture through the leaves. They're fed water year round by this mist. And you can see this mist if you live around mountains or you've been to places like the Smoky Mountains in the United States. It's sort of this mist that goes through, helps feed the trees water when there isn't rain. And because of that also, they have sort of different kinds of survival mechanisms for animals that live up in the highlands versus the ones that live in the lowlands. It's really a temperate climate, kind of near the equator, but it's caused strictly by these highlands. Craters, I want to call it Nimbago, and once again, that's horribly mispronounced. It's in Central Africa near the Serengeti. It's in Wildest Africa. The Wildest series of documentaries are very good because they kind of cover people and animals. A little bit more animals in nature, but they'll actually cover the local indigenous people as well too, which makes it a little extra interesting for me. But craters actually will contain an entire ecosystem that could be different than what's around. It's sort of that whole idea of those old like 50s movies or older book serials of the Lost World where you'd have like dinosaurs living in a crater. It might not be quite that extreme, but you can definitely have a crater where even if the animals are the same species, they're going to vary some from the animals outside because they're not going to be able to circumnavigate the crater walls if the crater is deep enough. The good thing is, though, craters can store more water, and that can be a good or a bad thing, but when it's a good thing, it helps creatures drink. So the life can usually thrive inside of craters. Now, if it's an active volcano, probably not, because you'll have like noxious sulfur coming up, and on Earth you might get these kind of critters called extremophiles that live around those as well too. Something else to think about: caves or microclimates. So one of the reasons early man are called cavemen, because we know that they lived in caves. Why did they choose caves? Well, they couldn't build McMansions. They couldn't build houses. They couldn't build apartments. So they would move into caves in groups, and they use it as a base of operations. And if the weather was too extreme, they could go into the cave, and they would be protected somewhat from the elements outside. And the other big thing, especially in caves, will be magma and lava. Magma, obviously, before it ejects from the earth, and lava on top of the earth. But they can create interesting microclimates as well, too. They totally change the soil composition around. It can be very bad, or it can be very, very good. You know, one of the things that always interested me when I was a child was this idea that why do people keep living next to volcanoes? Volcanoes erupt and kill people. But then I realized as I aged and I studied more that the soil around volcanoes is exceptionally fertile, so you can produce more crops. And if the volcano erupts every few hundred years, when you move there, you might not even know early on that it's a volcano. Today we do. And the good thing is, because we know it's a volcano, we can watch to see if it's going to erupt, flee a little bit faster than what people could when you have a volcano go off every 800 years and they live next to this mountain that maybe smokes once in a while, but they don't know it's a volcano. But that's also a problem that could potentially be solved within magic as well too, where you have mages whose jobs are to monitor the volcano the same way we have seismologists. And the other interesting thing I use with magma in my world, and I don't want to get into too much detail on it, are there's dwarfs that live under the planet surface, and they sort of tunnel back and forth through the world. And one of the areas they typically build cities on are near high levels of magma pockets, because it helps warm the cave structures. They don't use it for light or anything like that, but what they do use it for is if they can build close enough to it without breaking into it, it will help warm the ground and help create a warmer cave than what it should necessarily be. Maybe I have that backwards, but that's the way it works in my mind. That's ironically one of the things I've not really done a lot of research on. Now, why should you consider microclimates? There's something that naturally happened. You know, it's the reason why, you know, people will drive from northern Connecticut and western Mass to the shore, or they'll go out to Boston Harbor, or they will head down to Rhode Island to the beach, or up to Maine or New Hampshire to the beach. And that's because it's better weather most of the year. Not always, but most of the year it's a little nicer near the ocean. Sea breeze comes in, it'll clean out your sinuses. If you have allergies, it'll wipe that problem away, temporarily at least, because the salt will sort of pervade through the air. But the climate itself is actually more comfortable. And even when it's warmer, because you have the cool breeze off the ocean blowing on you, it kind of makes up for it. So I can really see why people live in the Caribbean. You know, it should be exceptionally hot there because of the proximity to the equator. But, you know, you get sea breezes on at least parts of those islands. The rating for this episode. I consider this an intermediate topic because when you're doing a first brush through on a world that is framework based, you're not going to probably think about this. You might a little bit, like, you're going to have an idea that these are islands and maybe the weather's a little better than it should be where they are compared to the equator of the planet. But in general, you're not going to think much about, oh, what are the effects of the ecology inside of that giant crater of evil versus the outside of the giant crater of evil. The world building task for the day. Look at the map for the world that you're working on for your current work in progress, and sort of think about the areas and think, are there things, is there abundance of water? Is there proximity to the ocean and possibly sea breezes? Are there craters? What are the kinds of things that naturally will create microclimates? And then what are areas with cities? Areas with cities are going to have different temperature ranges than the areas around them. That's another big area where really a microclimate is created around the city, especially with the, with all of the roads that we have in modern cities and stuff like that, with all the black pavement or black roofs on suburban homes. Those are going to naturally absorb sunlight, and maybe it's minuscule, I don't know, but the weather's going to be slightly different than it would be without. And on plant life, obviously, and on animal life, it's going to radically have an effect. Where it could be like the United States, where there aren't a lot of noticeable animals that you see in the cities outside of pets, to places like India, where you have hordes of monkeys that go into bazaars and steal food from street vendors, which is very cool. And I saw that in Wildest India. Once again, Wildest series, very cool. The real world task for today, be polite. And when I say this, I'm not saying just in general, be polite when someone's rude to you. If you want to respond rude to rude, that's the choice you get to make. And really, you can ignore me here too, or for any of my suggestions. But when I say be polite, when I'm being checked out by a cashier, it's thank you, sir or ma'am. It's thank you, sir or ma'am. And sir or ma'am might not be the words you use to be polite, but that's just how I was raised. But I just believe that, these people are doing me a favor by working that job, even if it's for a short period of time, and serving me. So I'm very grateful to people who serve me and help make my life easier. So I'm not farming food in my yard, bringing it in, cleaning it, or trading it off for other kinds of food to feed my family. And I have times to do things like this or my day job. The tease for the next episode, World Explorers, or as I like to call it, the Erratic Explorers, visit Middle Earth. And as always, make sure to go to gardul.com. That's GARDUL.com for the show notes. It'll be under podcasting, World Builders Anvil. That's a great place to get all of the information from the episode that you've just listened to, and to see all the resources that we've talked about in this episode. Thanks for joining us this episode of the World Builders Anvil. Please be sure to rate and review us in iTunes, and please help get the word out to your friends about our show. And join me, Jeffrey W. Ingram at gardul.com, to see the progress of my world and learn why I made the choices I did. And please contact me and let me know the topics you would love to hear in the future. Now strike while the myth rolls high.